Section 68 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 8, Spheres of Action, Miscellaneous Business, Chapter 16, Part 7. The Seal of Confession. When, in 1216, the Fourth Council of Lateran rendered auricular confession imperative, it was essential that the father confessor should be bound to preserve absolute silence as to the sins revealed to him. For a time there were some exceptions admitted, as heresy, for instance, but eventually the obligation became universal, and the schoolmen exhausted their ingenuity in devising the most extreme cases by which to illustrate the inviolability of what has become known as the seal of confession. Human nature being what it is, and priestly nature being subject to human infirmities, the violation of the seal has at all times been a source of anxiety, and the object of rigorous punishment administered to the secular clergy by the spiritual courts, and to the regulars by their superiors. The Roman Inquisition, in the first half-century of its existence, assumed exclusive cognizance of the offence, and demanded that all offenders, whether secular or regular, should be tried by its tribunals. But in 1609 it abandoned its jurisdiction and left them to their bishops and prelates. As the heresy involved in betraying the confidence of the penitent was only an inferential error as to the sacrament, an artificial pretext like that devised with regard to solicitation, the Spanish Inquisition did not hold it to be comprised in the general delegation of faculties, but that a special papal commission was requisite. No attempt seems to have been made to obtain this until 1639, when, on October 11th, the Suprema addressed Philip IV a consulta, setting forth that numerous denunciations were received by the tribunals against confessors who revealed confessions, and that inquisitors were asking urgently for permission to prosecute such cases as violations of divine, natural, and political law, rendering culprits suspect in the faith, this being even more derisory of the sacrament than solicitation. It was notorious that the ordinaries did not check it among the secular clergy, nor their prelates among the regulars, nor could in such hands any remedy be efficacious, because in public trials the witnesses would be bought off or frightened off, and there were no secret prisons to assure the necessary segregation of the accused. The king was therefore asked to procure from the pope for the Inquisition exclusive jurisdiction over the offence. The Suprema probably did not exaggerate as to the denunciations received by the tribunals, for in the minor one of the Canaries we find it in 1637 receiving testimony against Diego Arteaga, priest of Hierro, for this offence, in 1643 against Diego Salgado, priest of La Palma, and in 1644 against Fray Matias Pinto of Teneriffe. There can be no doubt that Philip, as usual, acceded to the request of the Suprema, but Urban VIII seems not to have been responsive. He had a plausible reason for declining in the fact that the Roman Inquisition had abandoned its jurisdiction over the matter, and at the moment he was at odds with the Spanish over the question of censorship and of the Plomos del Sacro Monte. The offence was never included in the Edict of Faith, but occasionally it is enumerated among the charges against confessors on trial for solicitation, as in the cases of the Franciscan Fray Juan Panchan de Salas in Mexico in 1712, of the Carmelite Ventura de San Joaquin in 1794, and of Fray Antonio Ortuno in 1807. It was difficult to eradicate belief in the competence of the Inquisition, and as lately as 1808 José Antonio Alvarez, priest of Horcajo de los Montes, was denounced for this offence to the Toledo tribunal, but the trial was suspended, probably through doubt as to jurisdiction. When the question was brought up squarely in the case of Dr. Don Francisco Torneo before the Valencia tribunal, after due discussion, it decided, March 28, 1816, that it had no jurisdiction, and the case was accordingly dismissed. General utility. The efficient organization of the Inquisition and the dread which it inspired caused it to be invoked in numberless contingencies, most diverse in character and wholly foreign to the objects of its institution. A brief enumeration of a few of these will serve to complete our survey of its activity, and, trivial as they may seem, to illustrate how powerful was the influence which it exercised over the social life of Spain. The value of its services arising from the indefinite extent of its powers was recognized early. In 1499 a Benedictine monastery complained to Ferdinand that it had pledged a cross to a certain Pedro de Santa Cruz and could not recover it, as he had placed himself under protection of Dominicans who claimed exemption from legal processes. Ferdinand thereupon ordered the inquisitors of the city to settle the matter. They neglected it, and he wrote again peremptorily, instructing them to seize the cross and do justice between the parties. In April 1500 the king instructs the Valencia tribunal to recover for Don Ramon Lopez of the Royal Guard 2 runaway slaves and some plate which they had stolen. Evidently there was no little variety of duties expected of the Holy Office. In 1518 a nunnery of Clares in Calatayud complained that within 10 paces of their house there had been built a Mercenarian convent, of which the inmates were disorderly. The nuns could not walk in their garden without being seen, and great scandals were apprehended. Charles V applied to Leo X to have the Mercenarians replaced by Benedictines or Geronimites, and the Inquisition was invoked to assist. Parties sometimes obtained papal briefs to have their suits transferred to the tribunals. In 1548 Dona Aldonza Cerdan did this in a litigation with Don Hernando de la Caballeria, and in 1561 Dona Isabel de Francia in a suit with Don Juan de Heredia. In both cases the inquisitors of Saragossa refused to act, until Inquisitor General Valdez ordered them to do so. All inquisitors were not thus self-restrained, for when about this time a general command was issued forbidding them to prosecute for perjury committed in other courts, it shows that they had been asked to do so, and that some of them at least were ready to undertake such business. In 1647, when the prevalence of duelling called for some effective means of repression, among the remedies proposed was that sending a challenge should be made a matter for the Inquisition, on the ground that the infamy accruing to the offender and his descendants would be the most effective discouragement to punctilious gentlemen. The suggestion apparently was not adopted, but it illustrates the readiness to have recourse to the elastic jurisdiction of the Holy Office. The Jesuits found the Inquisition of much service when, through the favor of Olivares, they were enabled to invoke its intervention in one of their quarrels with the Dominicans. In 1634 Fray Francisco Reales issued a pamphlet against the society, and Dr. Espino, an ex-Carmelite, published 2 others. They were answered by Padre Salazar, and there the matter might have ended, but the Jesuits appealed to Philip IV and to Olivares, who promised satisfaction, and ordered the Inquisitor General, Sotomayor, himself a Dominican, to take action, with the significant hint that he would be watched. A royal decree of January 29, 1635, rebuked the Suprema for lack of zeal, and ordered it to act with all diligence and to inflict severe punishment. It responded promptly on February 1st with an edict suppressing the pamphlet of Reales, under heavy penalties, but this did not suffice, and on June 30th it prohibited every one, layman or ecclesiastic, from saying anything in private or in public derogatory to any religious order or the members thereof, under exemplary penalties, to be rigorously executed, a decree which had to be repeated in 1643. On June 27, 1635, the 3 obnoxious pamphlets were burned with unprecedented ceremony. There was a solemn procession of the officials and familiars with the standards of the Inquisition, while a mule with carmine velvet trappings bore a chest painted with flames in which were the condemned writings. It traversed the principal streets to the plaza, where a fire was lighted. A herald with sound of trumpet proclaimed that the Company of Jesus was relieved of all that had been said against it, and that these papers were false, calumnious, impious, and scandalous. They were cast by the executioner into the flames, and then the box and the procession wended their way solemnly back to the Dominican College of San Tomas. The effect of the demonstration, however, was somewhat marred by the populace believing that the box contained the bones of a misbelieving Jew, and accompanying the procession with shouts of "Death to the dogs!" and other pious ejaculations. Espina was arrested and incarcerated, not for the last time, for in 1643 he boasted that he had been imprisoned 15 times for his attacks on the Jesuits. Roales was more fortunate. He was a chaplain, Philibert of Savoy. His pamphlet had been printed in Milan, and he was safe in Rome. But a printer who had issued an edition in Saragossa was arrested and presumably sent to the galleys, and a Dominican Fray Cañamero, who had circulated the 3 pamphlets, was ordered to be arrested, but seems to have saved himself by flight. Still the irrepressible conflict continued, and the Inquisition was kept busy in prosecuting offenders and suppressing obnoxious utterances. It even construed its duty so rigidly that it condemned a memorial of the unfortunate creditors who suffered by the bankruptcy in 1645 of the Jesuit College of San Hermenegildo in Seville, when some 300 depositors lost 450,000 ducats and were struggling to rescue the remaining assets from the hands of the Jesuits. The Granada tribunal did not pause to inquire as to its jurisdiction when, in May 1646, owing to the scarcity of wheat, there were bread riots and the mob had control of the city. It summoned all the grain measurers and porters under pain of excommunication to appear before it on a matter of importance. By examining them, considerable stores of hidden corn were revealed. The corregidors registered it, and the price was fixed at 42 reales. This was volunteer action, but in 1648, when a pestilence was raging in Valencia, the tribunal was called upon to maintain the quarantine at one of the city gates. The king, on February 1, 1649, notified the Suprema that the pest had ceased in Valencia, but that it was violent at Cadiz, Sanlúcar, and other places, and urged continued vigilance, to which the Suprema replied that it had, since April, done its full duty, but that the municipal officials were very negligent, and it asked him to order them to do their share. Apparently the Inquisition was relied upon for quarantine work. As lately as July 2, 1818, the Suprema wrote to all the tribunals that the plague had appeared at Tangier and threatened Spain with the most terrible of calamities. The king had ordered energetic precautions in which all branches of the government must cooperate, and it was no time for hesitation or scruples. The tribunals were therefore instructed to keep watch on the officials of all departments and see that they did their duty, and if they could devise more effective measures, they were invited to make suggestions. The unlimited interference of the Inquisition with matters pertaining to episcopal supervision is seen in 2 or 3 cases tried by the Madrid tribunal. May 5, 1656, it sentenced the priest Francisco Perez Lozano to exile for a year from various places for his share in founding a confraternity with what were called statutos execrable. February 6, 1688, Juan Moreno de Piedrola, a priest of the Congregation of San Salvador, who proposed to establish a congregation in the rules of which the tribunal discovered censurable propositions, was ordered to surrender all the papers and not to discuss it in word or writing, and was exiled until he should have permission to return, with warning that otherwise he would be prosecuted with the full rigor of the law. As he was not required to abjure even de levi, it shows that there was no suspicion of heresy involved. Then, in 1697, Fray Juan Maldonado, of the Order of San Juan de Dios, had 3 years of exile for preaching in the church of his covenant at Ciudad Real a sermon characterized as burlesque and scandalous, though there is no hint of its being in any way heretical. This perpetual intrusion into all manner of affairs, irrespective of heresy, rather increased towards the last. In 1788, Antonio Lopez was prosecuted in Valencia for selling rosaries with bones made of clay as relics. In 1789, Andres Yuanez, a coachman, for a conversation on a superstitious subject. In 1791, the Carmelite Fray Bonifacio de San Pablo, for attempting to print a satirical paper. Joseph de la Rosa in Cordova, for carrying a consecrated wafer in a relic bag. Vicente Fellerit in Valencia, for a vain observance. In 1795, Don Miguel Catala, fiscal in Buñol, and Josef Sanchez Mesquifa, a scrivener, were prosecuted for using in drafting testaments the words diversos atributos when alluding to the Trinity. In 1799, Juan Rodriguez, a priest in Santiago, for assisting and performing ceremonies in a mock marriage. In 1808, Joseph Varquez de la Torre, a scrivener of Valencia, for drawing a deed of separation between spouses. In 1818, in Valencia, Vicente Micas, priest of Cedrillos, for not wanting his parishioners to die in the Franciscan habit. As all these cases presuppose denunciation, they illustrate the popular estimate of the all-embracing powers of the Inquisition and the espionage under which every Spaniard lived. In fact, there was scarce anything in which the Inquisition did not feel itself authorized to intervene. The latitude with which inquisitors construe their own powers is manifest in their assuming to issue licenses to hunt in prohibited places, sometimes for their own benefit and sometimes for that of others. This was an abuse which the Suprema strove to correct by forbidding it in 1527, but it was so persistent that the prohibition had to be repeated in 1530 and again in 1566. As the Inquisition was supreme within its jurisdiction and claimed the right to define the extent of its powers, there was no one to call it to account for their arbitrary exercise. If any other body in the state felt that its rights were invaded, the only recourse was to the sovereign, and we have seen how, under the Habsburgs, the crown, with scarce an exception, decided in its favor. Section 68.